The sun beat down mercilessly on the dusty streets of Redemption Creek, a town that had forgotten what mercy looked like long ago. The blazing orb hung in the cloudless sky like a malevolent eye, watching with cruel indifference as human suffering unfolded below. 10-year-old Samuel wiped the sweat from his brow with a trembling hand as he stood barefoot on the scorching wooden planks outside Murphy's saloon, his small frame trembling not from fear, but from the searing heat that rose through the soles of his feet like liquid fire straight from the depths of hell itself. The planks beneath his feet had been baking in the relentless sun for hours, absorbing heat until they became instruments of torture. Each board was warped and weathered, with splinters that caught the light and gaps that offered no relief from the burning surface. Samuel could smell the acrid scent of his own flesh beginning to burn, a nauseating reminder of his helpless situation. "Stand there until sunset, boy," Murphy had growled earlier that morning when he'd caught Samuel taking a single piece of stale bread from the saloon's garbage bin. The saloon owner's whiskey-stained breath had made Samuel's empty stomach turn. With revulsion, the smell of alcohol and decay overwhelming his senses. "Maybe then you'll think twice before stealing from honest folks again." Murphy's cruel laughter had echoed through the morning air, a sound that still rang in Samuel's ears like the cawing of carrion birds as the hours crawled by like wounded animals dragging themselves across the desert to die. The townspeople of Redemption Creek walked past the orphaned boy as if he were invisible, as if his suffering was just another piece of the scenery they'd grown accustomed to ignoring. Their boots kicked up small clouds of dust that settled on Samuel's already dirty clothes, adding insult to injury. Some cast pitying glances that lasted barely a heartbeat before their eyes darted away in shame. Others looked away entirely, their consciences pricking them like thorns, but their courage failing them completely. None dared challenge Murphy's twisted sense of justice, for they all knew the consequences of crossing the most powerful man in town. Samuel had learned long ago that in this unforgiving place, compassion was a luxury most couldn't afford, and courage was even rarer than water in the desert. The few people who might have helped him were either too afraid of Murphy's retaliation or too concerned with their own survival to risk standing up for a homeless orphan boy with no money, no family, and no future. His feet were beginning to blister badly now, the skin turning angry red and then white as the planks burned through his flesh like brands. The pain shot up his legs like lightning strikes during a summer storm, each tiny shift he made to redistribute his weight, bringing fresh waves of agony that made his vision blur and his knees buckle. Samuel bit his lip hard to keep from crying out, tasting the metallic flavor of his own blood as he fought to maintain what little dignity he had left in this cruel world. He'd rather die standing tall than give Murphy the satisfaction of seeing him break, of seeing him beg for mercy that would never come from such a heartless man. The boy's mind drifted desperately to better times, trying to escape the present, horror by retreating into memories that felt increasingly like dreams. He remembered when his parents were still alive and he had a real home with wooden walls that kept out the cold wind and rain, a stone fireplace that crackled with warmth on winter nights, and a kitchen table where food appeared regularly without him having to beg or steal for it. His mother had been beautiful, with kind eyes and gentle hands that could soothe any hurt with just a touch. His father had been strong and patient, always willing to answer questions and share his knowledge of the world beyond their small farm. Those memories felt like they belonged to someone else entirely now, faded and distant as morning mist. His mother's gentle voice singing lullabies while she tucked him into bed, her stories about brave knights and noble quests that made him believe the world was fundamentally good. His father's strong hands lifting him onto broad shoulders to watch. The 4th of July parade, pointing out the different horses and explaining how to tell a good mount from a poor one. The smell of fresh biscuits baking in their small kitchen. The sound of his parents' quiet laughter in the evenings as they sat together on the porch watching the sunset paint the sky in brilliant colors, all gone now, swept away by the fever that had claimed them both within a single terrible week, leaving him alone in a world that had no place for orphaned children. The neighbors, who had promised to look after him, had quickly grown tired of the burden, passing him from house to house like an unwanted package, until finally abandoning him entirely to fend for himself on the harsh streets of frontier towns. The shadows grew incrementally longer as the sun continued its relentless journey across the cloudless sky, but not nearly long enough for Samuel's desperate situation. Time seemed to move like cold molasses, each minute stretching into an eternity of suffering. His vision began to blur more seriously now as dehydration took its toll on his small, weakened body. His legs shook violently from standing in one position for so many hours, muscles cramping and spasming, and he could feel his strength ebbing away like water through a broken dam. The world around him seemed to shimmer and dance in the heat waves rising from the street, creating mirages that mocked his desperate thirst. Just when he thought he might finally collapse and give Murphy the victory, the cruel man so desperately wanted to witness, the steady clip-clop of horse hooves caught his attention through the haze of pain and exhaustion. Through his blurred vision, he could make out a lone rider approaching from the east, sitting tall and straight in his saddle, despite the dust that covered his weathered face and travel-stained clothes. The man's hat was pulled low against the glare of the sun, casting deep shadows across features that spoke of countless trails ridden under burning skies and endless nights slept under star-filled heavens. The horse beneath him was a magnificent chestnut mare, her coat gleaming even through the road dust that covered everything in this god-forsaken place. Her eyes were intelligent and alert, her gait steady and sure, despite the heat that made lesser animals stumble. She seemed to sense her rider's growing concern as they drew closer to the boy, her ears pricking forward attentively, and her pace slowing naturally, as if she too understood that something was terribly wrong with this scene of casual cruelty. Jake Morrison had ridden into Redemption Creek with business on his mind, cattle prices to discuss with the local buyers and supplies, to purchase before heading back to his ranch in the rolling hills north of town. He'd been looking forward to a cold beer, a hot meal, and perhaps a game of cards before finding a room for the night. But the sight before him made his blood run cold, and his mundane business concerns evaporate like morning dew under the desert sun. A child, barely more than skin and bones, stood barefoot on planks that could fry an egg, his small body swaying dangerously in the brutal heat like a sapling in a windstorm. The cowboy's weathered hands tightened unconsciously on the reins as righteous anger flared in his chest like a wildfire catching dry grass. He'd seen plenty of cruelty in his 43 years of life on the frontier, had witnessed the worst that desperate men could do to each other during cattle drives and in lawless frontier towns, where might made right and compassion was seen as weakness. But there was something about seeing a child tortured so casually, so publicly, that awakened a protective fury he hadn't felt since his own younger brother had been killed by raiders years ago. "What in God's name is this about?" Jake's voice cut through the oppressive afternoon heat like a blade through silk, sharp and demanding, and carrying the unmistakable authority of a man accustomed to being obeyed. The question rang out across the street with such force that several people stopped in their tracks to stare at this newcomer who dared to question the established order. Murphy appeared in the saloon doorway almost immediately, his massive belly straining against his filthy apron, his small eyes already calculating how to handle this unexpected interruption to his entertainment. His face was flushed with drink and heat, and his expression showed the irritation of a man who didn't like his authority being questioned by strangers. "None of your concern, cowboy," Murphy said, his tone carrying all the arrogance of a man who'd never been seriously challenged, who'd grown fat and comfortable on the fear and submission of others. Boy's learning himself a valuable lesson about taking what don't belong to him. Maybe you should mind your own business and move along. Jake dismounted slowly, deliberately, his boots hitting the dusty ground with the finality of a judge's gavel. Every movement was controlled and purposeful, like a predator sizing up potential prey. "Only lesson I see here," he said, his voice quiet, but carrying the weight of mountains and the promise of storms, "is what happens when a grown man forgets his basic humanity." Murphy's face began to redden dangerously as he stepped fully out of the saloon's shade and into the blazing sunlight, his hand instinctively moving closer to the worn grip of the gun holstered at his hip. The weapon was a Colt .45, well-maintained, but showing signs of frequent use, and Murphy's fingers drummed against his thigh in a way that suggested he was comfortable using it. "You don't know what you're talking about, stranger," he said, his voice taking on a menacing edge. "This boy's been nothing but trouble since the day he dragged himself into our town like some kind of diseased animal, stealing food, begging for handouts, sleeping in doorways where decent folks have to step over him. The good people of Redemption Creek are sick and tired of his kind." Jake's piercing blue eyes never left Murphy's face as he spoke, reading every micro-expression, every nervous tick, every tell that revealed the man's true cowardly nature beneath his bluster and bravado. He'd dealt with bullies like Murphy before, men who preyed on the weak and defenseless, but crumbled when faced with real opposition. "Decent folks, you say?" Jake's voice remained level and controlled, but those who knew him well would have recognized the dangerous edge creeping into his tone like ice forming on a pond. "What's decent about torturing a hungry child? What's decent about making a spectacle of suffering? What's decent about a grown man who gets his entertainment from the pain of someone who can't fight back?" Samuel watched through eyes that were growing increasingly difficult to keep open as this stranger, this cowboy, who didn't even know his name or his story, stepped between him and Murphy's rage, like a guardian angel sent from heaven itself. The man was tall and lean, with the kind of weathered strength that came from years of hard work under an unforgiving sun. His clothes were dusty from travel but well made, and his hands, though gentle when they touched Samuel's shoulder, looked like they could handle whatever trouble might come their way. For the first time in months of despair and hopelessness, someone was standing up for him. Someone was seeing him as a human being worth defending, rather than just a nuisance to be dealt with. Hope, that dangerous emotion he'd buried so deep in his heart that he thought it was dead and gone forever, began to stir weakly in his chest, like embers being carefully fanned back to life by a gentle breeze. The crowd that had begun to gather grew steadily larger as word spread through the dusty streets that something interesting was happening at Murphy's saloon. Mrs. Henderson from the boarding house peered over the shoulders of the men in front of her, her grey hair pinned back severely and her face showing the kind of disapproval that only proper ladies could muster. Old Pete from the blacksmith shop wiped his massive hands on his leather apron as he joined the growing circle, his arms still glowing with heat from the forge. Even some of the working girls from the rooms upstairs at the saloon had come to their windows to watch the drama unfold in the street below, their painted faces showing curiosity and something that might have been hope. Without breaking his intense eye contact with Murphy for even a second, Jake reached down and began methodically unlacing his boots. The leather was worn but lovingly cared for, obviously expensive when new and maintained with the kind of attention that spoke of a man who understood the value of good equipment. These were the boots of someone who spent his life on horseback and on foot across difficult terrain, boots that had carried him through desert heat and mountain cold, through river crossings and rocky passes. "Boy needs these more than I do right now," Jake said simply, his voice carrying clearly across the now silent crowd. The simple statement carried more moral weight than a full sermon, and several people in the gathering shifted uncomfortably as they realized they were witnessing something that would define not just this moment, but their own characters as well. You can't just... Murphy started to protest, but something in Jake's eyes, something cold and implacable and utterly without fear, made the words die in his throat like flowers in drought. The saloon owner had bullied plenty of people over the years, had used his size and his money and his connections to get his way in most situations. But he was beginning to sense that this cowboy was cut from entirely different cloth than the usual drifters and settlers who passed through town. Jake knelt beside Samuel with movements that were surprisingly gentle for such an obviously dangerous man, his weathered face softening as he took in the full extent of the boy's condition up close. The child looked even worse than he had from a distance, and Jake felt his anger grow cold and sharp, like a blade being honed on stone. Samuel's lips were cracked and bleeding from dehydration. His clothes were little more than rags that barely held together, and his thin frame spoke eloquently of too many meals missed, too many nights sleeping hungry and cold in whatever shelter he could find. "What's your name, son?" Jake asked softly, his voice a stark contrast to the harsh tones that had filled the air moments before. His tone was the kind that fathers used with frightened children, gentle but strong, offering comfort without demanding anything in return. "Samuel, sir," the boy whispered, his voice barely audible and rough from thirst, hardly daring to believe this was real and not some heat-induced hallucination brought on by his suffering. No adult had spoken to him with such kindness in so long that he'd almost forgotten what it felt like to be treated like a human being rather than a pest. "Well, Samuel, let's get these boots on your feet and see if we can't make you a little more comfortable." Jake's hands were steady and sure as he helped the boy step carefully into the boots, supporting his weight when Samuel's legs threatened to give out entirely. The boots were far too big, comically oversized on Samuel's small feet, but they felt like heaven against his burning, blistered soles. The leather was cool and smooth, still holding a hint of morning coolness, and for the first time in hours, the constant pain began to recede to a manageable level. Dr. Elizabeth Hayes pushed through the crowd with determination, her medical bag clutched tightly in her weathered but capable hands. She was one of the few people in town who'd shown Samuel any kindness over the past months, occasionally treating his cuts and bruises when Murphy's previous punishments had gotten particularly harsh. Her face was flushed with anger and professional concern as she took in the scene, her trained eye immediately assessing the damage that had been done. "Let me examine this child immediately," she said firmly, her voice brooking absolutely no argument from anyone present. She knelt beside Samuel with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd spent decades dealing with injury and suffering, her hands already beginning their quick but thorough assessment, while Jake watched Murphy with unwavering intensity, like a hawk watching a snake coiled to strike. "This is unconscionable," Dr. Hayes announced after her examination, her voice carrying across the crowd with the authority of medical knowledge and moral outrage. "This boy is severely dehydrated, his feet are badly burned, and he's showing clear signs of heat exhaustion that could become life-threatening. He needs immediate medical attention, not punishment. What kind of people have we become that we allow such cruelty in our streets?" Her words hung in the air like an indictment, and several people in the crowd shifted uncomfortably, their eyes dropping to the dusty ground as shame washed over them like a tide. They all knew she was right. They all knew they should have acted sooner, but fear and complacency had made cowards of them all. Murphy scoffed loudly, but his voice lacked some of its earlier confidence as he felt the mood of the crowd beginning to shift against him. "Boy's nothing but trouble, Doc, and you know it as well as anyone. Been stealing food, sleeping in doorways, causing problems for decent folks trying to make an honest living. His parents are dead, nobody wants him, and he needs to learn his place in the world before he gets himself or someone else hurt. The cruel words hit Samuel like physical blows, each one a reminder of his desperate situation and his complete helplessness. But before despair could reclaim him entirely, Jake's voice cut through the air like thunder rolling across the plains, filled with righteous anger and absolute certainty. Subscribe to our channel now to see how this incredible story of courage and compassion continues to unfold. Don't miss what happens next in this powerful tale. "He's hungry," Jake said with devastating simplicity, his tone matter-of-fact, but carrying an undertone that made everyone present stop and really listen for perhaps the first time in months. "When's the last time you went without food for 3 days straight, Murphy? When's the last time you slept in an alley with nothing but newspaper for a blanket? When's the last time you had to choose between your pride and your survival, between begging and starving?" The questions hung in the oppressive air like arrows finding their mark, and Murphy's face grew even redder as he struggled to find a response that wouldn't make him look even worse in front of the growing crowd. He opened his mouth several times, but no words came out that could justify what everyone could now see was pure cruelty, masquerading as justice. The crowd began to murmur among themselves, voices of agreement with Jake's words growing stronger and more numerous. Old Martha, who ran the general store with its shelves of canned goods and penny candy, stepped forward from the back of the group, her grey hair escaping from its pins in the heat and her weathered face set with determination. "The boy never caused me any trouble," she said loudly enough for everyone to hear, her voice carrying the authority of someone who'd lived in this town for 30 years and knew everyone's business. Always said please and thank you, even when he had nothing to buy with and was just looking at things he couldn't afford. More polite than half the paying customers I get, if you want the honest truth. Her words seemed to break a dam of suppressed feelings, and other voices began to join in. Tom the barber mentioned how Samuel had once helped an elderly lady carry her packages without being asked, expecting nothing in return. Sarah from the dress shop remembered the boy returning a coin he'd found on her floor instead of keeping it for himself. One by one, small acts of honesty and kindness were remembered and shared, painting a picture of a child who was fundamentally good despite his desperate circumstances. Samuel felt tears building in his eyes, but not from pain this time. These were tears of amazement, of overwhelming gratitude, of hope reborn from ashes. For months he'd felt invisible, worthless, like a ghost haunting the edges of other people's lives with no purpose and no future worth contemplating. He'd begun to believe Murphy's cruel words, to think that maybe he really was nothing but a burden on decent society. Now, strangers were speaking up for him, defending him, remembering small kindnesses he'd thought nobody had noticed. For the first time since his parents died, he felt like a human being worthy of compassion rather than just a problem to be solved or eliminated. Jake noticed the boy's emotional state and placed a gentle but firm hand on his shoulder, the weight of it somehow both comforting and protective, like a shield against the world's cruelty. "You're not alone anymore, Samuel," he said quietly, his voice carrying a promise that seemed to come from the very depths of his soul. "I give you my word on that, and I don't give my word lightly or to many people." Murphy's anger was reaching dangerous levels as he watched his authority being challenged so publicly and thoroughly by this interfering stranger. His face had gone from red to purple, and beads of sweat stood out on his forehead despite his position in the shade. His hand moved more deliberately toward the gun at his hip, a movement that didn't go unnoticed by Jake or several other men in the crowd who understood the deadly language of frontier violence. "You're making a big mistake, cowboy," Murphy snarled, his voice dropping to a threatening growl that he'd used successfully to intimidate people for years. "I run this town, and everybody here knows it. What I say goes, and these people all depend on me for their livelihoods." They know better than to cross me, and you'd be smart to learn the same lesson before you find yourself in more trouble than you can handle." Jake's response was calm, almost conversational, but those who knew anything about truly dangerous men would have recognized the steel beneath the silk, the promise of violence carefully controlled but ready to be unleashed if necessary. "Then maybe it's time for a change in management," he said with a slight smile that never reached his cold eyes. "Maybe it's time for people to remember what this country was supposed to stand for, what communities are supposed to do for their most vulnerable members." The crowd held its collective breath, sensing the tension building like storm clouds on the horizon, dark and pregnant with the promise of lightning. Children were quickly pulled behind their parents' legs, and several people began to edge backward, not wanting to be caught in the crossfire if violence erupted in the dusty street. Sheriff Tom Bradley finally arrived at a fast walk, drawn by reports of trouble at the saloon and the unusual size of the crowd gathered in what should have been a quiet afternoon. He was an older man, graying at the temples and soft around the middle, who'd grown tired of Murphy's bullying over the years, but had never found the courage to stand up to him alone. The saloon owner had too much influence in town affairs, too many connections with important people, and too much money flowing through his establishment to be easily challenged. "What's going on here?" Bradley asked, though his experienced eyes immediately took in the scene before him. Jake standing barefoot on the burning planks with obvious discomfort. Samuel wearing boots that were far too big for his small feet. Murphy red-faced with rage and humiliation, and a crowd of townspeople, watching with a mixture of fear and anticipation that suggested something significant was happening. "Just teaching some folks about basic human decency, Sheriff," Jake said evenly, his tone suggesting that he was the reasonable one in this confrontation and that any rational person would see the justice of his position. "Something this town seems to have forgotten how to show to those who need it most." Dr. Hayes stood up from her continued examination of Samuel, her face grave with professional concern and personal outrage. "Sheriff Bradley, this child has been subjected to cruel and unusual punishment that would be considered torture in any civilized place," she said, her voice carrying the weight of medical authority. "His feet are badly burned. He's showing signs of severe heat exhaustion that could become life-threatening, and he's clearly malnourished. If this continues, he could suffer permanent damage or even death." The sheriff looked deeply uncomfortable, caught between Murphy's considerable influence and what was clearly the morally right thing to do. His badge felt heavy on his chest, as he struggled with a decision that would define not just this moment, but his own character and the kind of man he wanted to be remembered as. "Murphy, maybe we should what?" Murphy exploded, his composure finally cracking completely. "Like a dam bursting under pressure. Let every thief and vagrant run wild in our streets. Let them steal whatever they want without consequences. This boy's parents are dead, Sheriff. Nobody wants him. Nobody cares about him. He's nothing but a burden on decent society. If we don't, and teach him his place now, what kind of message does that send to every other beggar and criminal who thinks they can take advantage of our kindness?" Samuel flinched visibly at the harsh words, but Jake's reassuring presence beside him provided strength he didn't know he still possessed. The cowboy's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, and when he spoke again, his voice carried the quiet authority of a man who'd seen the worst of human nature and chosen to be something better. "His parents being gone doesn't make him nothing," Jake said quietly, but every person in the crowd heard him clearly. "Makes him someone who needs help, not punishment. Makes him someone who deserves protection, not persecution. Makes him exactly the kind of person a decent community should be rallying around, not tormenting for their own entertainment." The words struck home with devastating accuracy, and murmurs of agreement began to ripple through the gathered townspeople like wind through wheat. Jake could see the shift happening in real time, could feel the tide of public opinion beginning to turn decisively against Murphy's cruelty. "I'll tell you what, Murphy," Jake continued, his voice carrying across the silent crowd like a church. "Bell, you want to settle this like men? Fine by me. But when it's over, when we're done here, the boy comes with me. No more sleeping in alleys, no more going hungry, no more being treated like something people scrape off their boots. That's my offer, and it's the only one you're going to get." Murphy's eyes gleamed with malicious satisfaction, thinking he finally had the advantage in this confrontation. "You challenging me to a gunfight, Cowboy? You sure you want to take that chance with your life over some worthless orphan brat?" Jake's smile was cold as winter dawn, filled with a quiet confidence that made several people in the crowd step back involuntarily. "I'm not taking any chances, Murphy. I'm making you a promise, and I always keep my promises, good or bad. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel to follow this amazing journey and discover more incredible Old West stories that will touch your heart and inspire your soul. Hit that subscribe button now.